Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Resistance TV. It's Wednesday, 17th of August, and tonight I'm joined by my guest, Cathy Larkman, to talk about this new policy which has been brought into, it's advice and guidance that's been brought in nationally for police forces, which relates to sex and gender and strip searching and intimate searching of suspects. So I'd like to welcome Cathy to the show. Hiya. Hi. So Cathy, you're a retired police, let me get this right, police superintendent, operational superintendent with over 30 years experience within South Wales Police and with supervisory experience of frontline policing police officers.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I joined South Wales Police in 1989, retired last year in 2021. I actually did over my sort of term of service, which was 30 years. So I did about 31 and a half, trying to get my staff through some of the worst parts of the sort of COVID pandemic.
Yeah.
And, you know, I've obviously done a variety of roles, worked my way up from constable since joining in the late 80s, and was a really proud officer as well. I like to think I always tried to do the right thing, not the easy thing, because I think that's what leadership's all about, doing the right thing and not the easy thing. And I probably thought I was going to have a very sort of quiet, comfortable, pleasant retirement and taking up a few little hobbies.
Well, that hasn't quite happened in that way, has it? Best laid plans. So before we go into this and find out more about what this policy actually says and what the implications are and what your involvement in that is, just like to give a reminder to everybody that we will be allowing 15 minutes at the end of the session today for people so we're going to respond to questions. So please do put your comments and questions in the chat. It's great to hear from you. And thank you very much to everyone for all of your feedback over the first two sessions that we've run within this season. We did have some problems with the audio last week, but nevertheless, it feels like it's been positively received by people. So thank you for that. And I'd like to also please ask people to like and please also subscribe to the YouTube channel. If we have, I think we've got, you know, a good bunch of people, our audience is growing for these shows. And if we can kind of demonstrate that there's an interest for us to continue talking about women's issues and have those higher up on our agenda as an organization, I think that would be really, really good. And so as many people who can subscribe to the channel and share that would be really great. So thank you for that. So if you could, Cathy, just give us a rundown of what's changed. What's this new policy or new guidance? What does it involve? Is it mandatory for all of the different police forces? And what does it mean for people? What's it mean for women and also for police officers as well?
Well, there's over 40 sort of provincial police forces in England, Scotland, and Wales and Northern Ireland. Each is run up in terms of its sort of operational policing business by a chief constable who's sort of at the top of the tree, really, of operational policing. And there's obviously a rank structure sitting below that. Sitting alongside the chief constable then, in a manner of speaking, is the Police and Crime Commissioner, which, you know, I assume everybody might be aware of this, but I'm sort of happy to clarify any of this if needs be. And there's obviously other sort of organisations then, and one I'm going to be referring to a lot is the National Police Chiefs Council, or the NPCC, so I don't have to say it all the time. But the NPCC basically is the body that all the chief constables of all those forces covering in England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland come together and speak to other representatives like the Home Office, etc., and decide all their sort of relevant policies, things that they should be agreeing on, matters of sort of current public concern, etc. So it's a really important body of people, you know, affecting all of us here today in terms of sort of the policing we receive. Now, what sort of happened was really that I noticed last year in 2021, fresh out of retirement and freshly new into Twitter, I have to say as well. So I just say that first of all, that there was a lot of sort of public concern, and especially concern from women online around searching policies by the police. And And there was a lot of talk as well about you can be strip searched by a man if that man then sort of self-identifies as a woman. And I could see this as causing a lot of consternation, distress and worry. And women's issues have always been really, really important to me. So I knew that obviously that those women's concerns were really genuine, really real. You know, we'd come out of several sort of really high profile, horrendous situations involving police interaction with women. And, you know, one particular one, obviously, you know, Sarah Everard, you know, and the horrific circumstances around what happened to that poor woman was obviously adding to that sort of distress, concern. And public trust and confidence in the police is really, really important because they're our police service. You know, that's really important and really precious to me particularly. So seeing all this sort of consternation online, I thought, you know, this really needs to be addressed. So I wasn't convinced really the police service was seeing it and the NPCC was seeing it, and it needed to be laid at their front door. So last year in October, I wrote a very comprehensive letter, she's still here, one to the National Police Chiefs Council, the head of the National Police Chiefs Council, because there's always like an officer who leads that. And I sent a similar letter to the College of Policing, which sort of sets the standards for policing across the UK as well. I also sent a similar letter to the Police Federation of England and Wales, who represent officers of the rank of PCs, sergeants and inspectors, because it's going to be mainly PCs and sergeants affected by this as well. I have to say, sort of at street level. And I sent one as well to Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary too, because they got a role in terms of sort of, you know, making sure the police are doing what they're supposed to be doing and the level at which they're doing it. So I wrote a letter and I sort of laid my cards out on the table. I said, look, all this, you know, in a nutshell, all this consternation is going on around searches. You know, you need to lay out what the law actually is in relation to this before it escalates any further. And I just read out a line from that letter, just so that, you know, this was reiterated several times in different ways. There is currently a public climate of fear amongst women and girls around their personal safety. Women need to know the limits of police powers and the lack of clarity around stop search, and who can indeed subject them to invasive searches is not helping with this. So I really laid out my concerns. I asked them to clarify the current situation in relation to strip and intimate searches. So that's sort of the background to it. I don't know if everybody listening in is aware, but there's not a one-size-fits-all search that may happen to you. So, you know, if you think of a search on the street initially, that could be a basic search, which would be basically jacket, outer coat, gloves, and a bit of a pat down, etc. That in theory can be carried out under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act by any officer. And in my old force, we'd actually record those on body-worn video for transparency as well, so that, you know, we'd be accountable and we'd be able to make sure that they were being carried out properly, etc. And you know, to help people with public trust. Stepping up from that, then, there's a more thorough search, which may involve the removal of items of clothing. That has to be carried out of public view, and the Police and Criminal Evidence Act says that that has to be carried out by an officer of the same sex. So PACE, Police and Criminal Evidence Act, says of the same sex. There's no mention of gender there, it's sex. Yeah. And it's a really, really important distinction, which I'm sure we're going to go on to. And then you've got sort of strip searches, which is the sort of basically, you know, removal of clothing, which will involve the exposure of intimate parts of the body, which have to be carried out sort of in a building and out of public view. And again, officer of the same sex. And then intimate searches, which are subject to, which won't be a street level search, would be as like a search when you're already in custody and carried out under certain circumstances. It's got to be authorised under certain circumstances as well. And, you know, they are carried out by a medical practitioner. But again, there's a lot of regulations around them, around the officers present needing to be of the same sex as well, for obvious reasons, you know, privacy, dignity, all those reasons.
Yeah.
So I asked the MPCC just basically, lay it out, because this is what I know PACE says. And, and if you lay it out, obviously those issues around women's trust and confidence may dissipate then, once people realise the situation and they know what their rights are in respect to this. So things sort of basically sort of petered along for a little while. And then it was around about in March, I'm sort of checking the dates here, I had a reply from the NPCC, basically with a policy that they'd agreed in December 2021 at a meeting of all the police, all the chief constables of the area, where they had considered a recommendation from the NPCC LGBTQ plus lead, Vanessa Jardine, which basically said that those searches, that more thorough search, strip search, intimate search, which PACE says requires an officer of the same sex, that they had decided and agreed that that would no longer apply in effect. Their interpretation of that would be that once an officer says that self-identifies as another gender, they started using the terminology gender within that. Once the officer self-identify that was their lived gender, that they could then search a person of the same gender as they'd self-identified into. So, to me, that flew in the face of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. I was really worried about what I'd seen in that sort of paper that they considered, because I couldn't see any consideration whatsoever of the impact on women, on how women may feel about this. And I appreciate, I have to say, that men may have feelings around privacy and dignity as well. I don't mean to diminish any of those, but obviously I was coming from the point of view of females primarily in mind. But they hadn't appeared to take any regard to that at all. They hadn't given, the only sort of nod that they had really to the woman's feelings was that the woman could object and ask for somebody else. But a female being searched is not necessarily going to be aware that she can object, especially if she's overwrought or, feeling under a lot of pressure, etc. And to me, that's not good enough.
No.
As a police officer, you've got a responsibility really, in terms of accountability and an invasive tactic like search, making sure it's carried out impeccably, because it can go wrong, it goes wrong. So I thought they were tone deaf. And I'm still quite shocked, Mandy, I have to say, with the response.
So what exactly was the response? It was just that you got to see the guidance and there was no evidence of any consultation with women or consideration of how women or men might feel about that.
No, none at all. I mean, there was a lot of consideration in terms of police officers who would, be carrying out the searches, who were self-identifying, and the impact there may be on those officers if, a woman in this case objected to being searched by them. There was a lot of consideration for the police officers, but for a policing service which is supposed to value the community and the public primarily, that was absent. That was totally absent, and that was deeply worrying to me, which is why I made the decision then to go public with it.
Okay, so that was the turning point when you decided I need to do something about it. Yes, because there's a couple of things really that come to mind. Loads of things that come to mind. Okay, so the PACE guidelines started talking about gender. Even the PACE guidelines talked about sex, but the new guidance started talking about gender out of the blue. Yeah,
absolutely. There was a massive conflation of sex and gender within the document that had been discussed and agreed by the NPCC. These are two totally different terms. Sex, as most people understand it and as defined, relates to your sort of natal sex, your biological sex. That's my understanding.
Yeah.
Gender to me is obviously, more of a sort of socially constructed, it's usually sort of stereotypical behaviour then. But lately, I think there's another issue here which has led us this problem, and that's people using the expression gender as a sort of polite euphemism instead of sex, because they don't want the connotation with sexual intercourse, so they use gender instead of the term.
Like when we talk about the gender pay gap, probably should have been saying the sex pay gap all of that time. Really, that would have been a lot clearer, wouldn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely, and I think as well, the term gender is, in modern sort of parlance, has also come to mean, some people believe that you've got an inner gender identity, which is what this is all about, isn't it, really? So it's this belief that, that inside you don't really feel like the sex that you actually are, and that's your gender identity, apparently. So
yes, and it's basically that it's just saying that you don't fit the usual stereotypical expectations of your sex. That's kind of
I have to say, I find that really regressive, because I think you can be many types of man, you could be many types of woman, can't you, really? And the fact that you like a man displays what's thought of as typically sort of feminine behavior, well, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, and equally exactly the same for a woman. What is wrong, really, with being yourself, as you are? You shouldn't be. It shouldn't be the case that if a woman likes playing football, I love football, that she's somehow told that she's actually a man. It's ridiculous.
So we've all got different ideas about what gender is and whether it even exists, or if it exists, whether it's regressive or whether it's an innate thing that people feel. We all believe different things about that, and that's okay. And the law kind of says that that's okay as well. But what we do know about sex is that women are at far greater risk of sort of rape, sexual assault and violence from men than men are from women, for example. So we know that it's different for us as women. So this does have potentially huge implications for women. And it's quite shocking to think that area of sensitivity hasn't even been broached at all. I think a lot of people will be quite shocked to discover that. It hasn't even been thought about, apparently.
Well, I was shocked, as a sort of police officer with 31 years service, I was really shocked by this. And it's just strange, really. I mean, I'm just going to refer to the letter again. I dug out from the MPCC site, a previous statement by them where they refer to an inquiry they were carrying out, and they talk about the rebuilding of women's trust. And they say in it, and I quoted this in the letter to them, police chiefs are listening to women's voices about what needs to change. Well, are they? Because quite clearly they haven't. So, that really, really worries me. Where are the brave, strong chief constables to say this is the law? We need to listen to the public here. This is ridiculous.
What sort of percentage of chief constables would you say are women?
There's quite a lot of women.
Is there? Right.
Yeah, there are. There weren't, obviously when I joined, there weren't any when I joined, but there weren't
that has changed.
Officers.
Yes.
It was very much a case of token policewomen on shifts, etc. But there are a lot of female chief constables now. Yeah. But I don't think it's just a case for the female chief constables to be standing up and sort of saying this. I think all chief constables need to, they need to apply the law. Yeah. They need to get back to policing without fear or favour, and policing impartially and not being affected by ideology, so that everybody can trust the police and have confidence in them.
What you mentioned about that women may not, if a woman's arrested, she's probably going to be in a state of feeling upset anyway. And we don't always manage to assert ourselves and our preferences when we're feeling upset. But there's also, would you agree with me that there's also the risk that a woman may not be happy about the situation of someone of the opposite sex doing the strip search or the intimate search, but she may feel, because there's been such a lot of pressure and because there's rainbows all over the police force and everywhere else, could she feel coerced and unable to speak up?
Absolutely, and I think that's I think you're spot on there, Mandy. I think that's a real risk as to what's going to happen. Policing doesn't take place in a vacuum. Stop search and searching is a sort of highly, especially when you get to strip searching and a more thorough search, is a highly invasive tactic. It's even more important because it's invasive that we get it right.
Yeah. So,
but it's an important tactic, to protect the individual, to protect the body.
Yes. Yeah, yeah. So thinking about what you said earlier as well about the trust in the British public, and we know that we had the murder of, well, the arrest, the abduction, the rape, and then the murder of Sarah Everard by Wayne Couzens, who was a serving police officer at the time. And that absolutely hammered women's confidence in general in policing within this country to such an extent that we then had that outpouring of, well, grief and anger at the protest that took place during lockdown. People defied lockdown. Everyone had kind of complied with it. I think most people had been really compliant with it, apart from the people leading the country, unfortunately. But we had that, and the police were also heavy-handed at that event. And then we've had sort of Bieber Henry and Nicole Smallman, the two sisters who were murdered, and pictures of them were shared by police officers, male police officers on WhatsApp. We had an independent report in February that found that some officers had been just casually joking about rape victims. And then we've had the strip search of child Q. It was a 15-year-old girl whose mum wasn't informed before that took place, which is in breach of what the guidelines say should happen. And there were also male officers present when she was strip searched, which also goes against the guidance. I mean, would you say that what women's confidence really is in policing in general within this country at the moment?
Well, my sort of impression is that it's really, really poor, really poor, which is why, again, it was so important that they got this searching guidance correct. I mean, you've quoted some awful examples there, excellent examples, if you know what I mean, but awful as well in terms of what happened, with regards to the sort of vigil for Sarah that took place. I mean, obviously that that had massive sort of media impact, and everybody saw the images, etc. And I've got to say, it's a really difficult job for police officers to manage sort of events and protests, and we understand. I think everybody sort of understands that. But then when you sort of see, those conversations that you referred to, those photographs having been taken and shared, completely unforgivable, horrendous events. What are those officers thinking about? And to be joking about things like rape, it's just completely beyond the pale and unacceptable. I wanted to make one point, Mandy, if that's okay as well, about the searching I haven't mentioned, and that is that the MPCC also mentioned within their agreed policy that if a woman objected and that objection was felt to be discriminatory behaviour, that consideration would be given to creating a non-crime hate incident, or even a hate crime, a crime if it passes the threshold.
Yeah. So if someone who's a police officer within that situation interpreted a woman's objections in that way, she could find herself criminalized. So not only is she forced to undergo that intimate search by someone of the opposite sex, but she herself could be criminalized for objecting if it's perceived as having been transphobic, I imagine.
Well, again, and that's what we don't have clarity over. But, the way things have gone before with sort of hate crimes and non-hate crime incidents, because a lot of these are sort of obviously played out in the public arena, and people, certain individuals have obviously, taken the step of challenging policing with regards to that. But we can see the harm that does then, and this woman who effectively, you could argue is being sexually assaulted by way of a strip search that arguably, should not be happening, because as a person of the same sex should be carrying it out and not the same gender, is then being criminalised potentially, or non-hate crime, non-crime hate incident against her. Are we going completely mad here? Have we lost the plot in policing? I'm not an embittered ex-officer.
No.
I'm a sort of 31 and a half year service officer who sort of went, well past retirement age, and it really worries and distresses me to see them making these decisions. What is going on?
I know that this is something that I discussed with you when we were planning this session, and I was kind of asking you about the police force and whether you perceive it to be more sexist or less sexist than it was in the past. And you'd kind of said to me that you most people, even though there might be dark humour within the police force, as just as there may be within, you know, some people that work within health or social services or whatever, sometimes there's dark humour, but actually incidences of people joking about things like rape and things like that, you'd said to me you thought that's actually quite rare within the police. I don't want people to feel frightened of the police. It seems as if something's happened at the managerial and at this senior level. Something's gone wrong at that level. This policy capture's happened there rather than on the front line of policing so much.
I'd say there is a distinction. I'd say rank and file officers, and I'm not negating, you know, there are rank and file officers involved in those horrendous cases that you've mentioned, you know, and it's simply inexcusable and quite rightly, you know, should be dealt with in, you know, in very sort of strong terms. But I think in terms of ideological capture, you may have a sprinkling of officers at sort of ground level who are well versed to that ideology really and are sort of, you know, potentially pushing it as well. But I think, you know, it's more in terms of the sort of senior levels of policing really, where, you know, you've got police forces agreeing to sign up to, you know, the Stonewall Diversity Champions scheme. We've got a number of forces, I think, who are, you know, currently on their equality index, etc. So you sort of see then this same language permeating through all the policies. So, you know, for instance, the MPCC in 2018 agreed some guidance, you know, and some of it was sensible in relation to staff members, etc., who identify as transgender, and that is fine, you know, some sensible guidance. But within that document, you know, they've used the language of Stonewall all the way through it. Stonewall are badged on the document. You know, the foreword to the document is written partially from Stonewall as well. You know, this isn't great, you know, because policing needs to be impartial and needs to be seen to be impartial. You know, and when I read that guidance, you know, I had a little bit of, you know, I had another fit really, because again, for the implications of police women, because I don't think people realise how badly police women are going to be affected by this, because police officers operate under a discipline code, which they're afraid of stepping out of line in relation to, so they're afraid of doing anything wrong in case, you know, their jobs end up at risk, really, in front of senior officers. So police women are being put in this position, and the guidance that I read related to individuals, you know, choosing to use changing rooms and showers, etc., at work. And again, not an ounce of sort of thought or consideration for what police may think about sharing those changing rooms, or showers, you know, and how they may feel. And I probably should say as well, Mandy, that I mentioned the Police Federation, who represent constables, sergeants, and inspectors. To this date, I've had no response from them, and they are the staff association that represent those officers. They haven't even bothered replying.
Lucy Masood, I was listening to, I don't know if you've heard her talk at all, but so I was listening to her being interviewed, because she was a firefighter before she became a barrister, wasn't she? But she was also involved in the fire FBU, the union. She was talking about in the sort of old days when she first became, because I think she was a firefighter for over 10 years, 12 years or something like that. And in the early days, women had to share changing rooms with male firefighters, and they didn't have any spaces of their own. And a lot of them had to get changed in their cars, and they didn't have their own toilets, etc. And when they actually, through the union or whatever, they managed to win those rights, they did have some men who would deliberately sabotage their spaces, who would deliberately go and wee all over the toilets and things like that. There was sexism still, you know, there was like a hangover of sexism. I don't know whether it continued longer term. How did you find things developed in terms of women's recognition and rights and being valued within the force over the years that you were in? Did you see anything like that, or was it not really like that?
Well, it was a totally different world when I joined, you know, and lots of sort of great officers then as well. But, you know, it was really, you know, it wasn't that many years since they'd sort of gotten rid of a specific policewoman's department, when women were actually paid only a proportion of the men's wage and only carried out certain duties. So, you know, the era in which I joined, you know, you were sort of joining very much, you know, as one of a very few policewomen on the shift, you know, very few holding anything above sort of middle management rank as well. I mean, I had my first child in early 1993. You know, the general sort of view of my colleagues around me was, oh, there's no way you'll come back to work after having a child, because nobody comes back. And the sort of provisions for looking after you during your pregnancy and work, you're just expected to patrol until you became too big for your uniform. So there was, I could sort of probably fill a day with sort of telling you about that, and about the casual, everyday sort of sexism. We didn't even, just to give you a bit of a laugh, we had to wear skirts as well. We weren't allowed to wear trousers. We had to wear skirts. And in my force, particularly as well, we were using truncheons at the time as well. The police women had a sort of a teeny version of a truncheon so that it would fit in their hand.
No way.
So it would
no way.
No, I'm serious. So the men had this huge thing, and the ladies had a little version, so it would fit in your handbag. So you can imagine how useful that was.
Yeah. I think it's important to, because also Lucy Masood was talking about they didn't have their own uniforms. They weren't made to fit women, so they had to wear men's uniforms.
Yeah.
So we've got to remember these things, because it's not that long ago, but it highlights how undervalued and underappreciated the differences between the sexes has been, and how much less power women have had, and still have to a large extent. And so when women are worried about things like these new guidelines, it's not for no reason. It's not to be mean or anything like that. Have you had anyone say to you, the work that you're doing around this to raise awareness is transphobic or is mean or unkind or anything like that?
Well, not to my face at the moment, Mandy, I have to say. And in fact, the people I've sort of known, sort of in my sort of previous work in life who have mentioned it, have all been really, really positive that it's the right thing. So I just like those senior officers really to step back a bit from the ideology and look at the big picture again, because I think they're letting people down. They're certainly letting women down.
Yeah. Okay, so before we sort of come back to that issue and look at maybe what needs to change, what people can do, and also what women have been discovering, because I know a number of women have written to their own chief constables within their own police forces, so we can find out a bit more about what the feedback has been so far, and if there's any reason to be hopeful for change at the moment. I thought it would be remiss if we didn't come back to the issue of hate crime and talk about what would you call it, freedom of speech and censorship, and the involvement of the police in some high-profile incidences just recently with that as well. I mean, what on earth is going wrong? What's going wrong? We've got this, let me have a look. We had the lady, I can't remember the woman, her name, she was on Twitter. And she'd posted a video. I mean, this is just the most recent. We had Kelly J. Keane, who had 2 police officers visit her house on the weekend to tell her that she'd been untoward about paedophiles. That was it. And they hadn't actually watched the video. They hadn't seen the video in order to verify whether the complaint about her was malicious or was accurate or anything like that. But they went straight round to her house in a day and age when police are really pressed for resources and for time and really overstretched. And then we had Lawrence Fox filming that guy who'd posted a meme that was found to have caused anxiety to one of his neighbors or to someone else on Facebook. And the guy got arrested, and Lawrence Fox also got arrested. And while they were being arrested, they were saying to the police, look, this is the law. And they were giving them chapter and verse, what you're doing. You've got no grounds to do this. There's no grounds for you to charge us with any of these things. I think there was a malicious intent or something like that was the charge that they were arrested on. And then they were released after hours of being, held in the cells without charge. And I think they're pressing charges themselves now against the police. And then more recently, we've had this poor woman, this amazing woman who stood her ground. She put a sticker on her door which said something about gender erases women or something like that. Gender ideology. Yeah, which really, when we're talking about these guidelines and what you're saying about everyone having shifted from talking about sex to talking about gender, when the law doesn't actually talk about gender in those terms when it comes to strip searching, you could say that's actually an accurate sticker. It's not actually mean about anybody. It's a description of what's actually happening in real time to policy at the senior level, in policing, in prisons, in how we respond to children in terms of their psychological health and their physical health, right across the board. So this woman, I don't know if you heard the clips of the video. It was so upsetting. Yeah, she's been a victim of rape twice. She was trying to say to this PCSO, I need spaces to be able to go which are women only. And the PCSO was saying to her, why do you know, what's wrong with, basically what's wrong with having men in your spaces? You need to be kinder. That was the gist of it, to someone who was a rape victim. I mean, any thoughts on how we got here? You know,
I've got loads of thoughts, but again, it's this conflation of sex with gender, isn't it? That's at the heart of all this, really, and the failure of public organisations to step up and properly consider these issues. You know, they're only listening to, certain parties, really, with regards to this. I mean, all those things you've outlined are absolutely horrendous, and they're there forever to be seen. I mean, I've listened to that recording of that sort of poor woman, really, and what she went through. I totally understand and respect her need for a single sex space in that, in those situations as outlined. You know, of course she needs a single sex space, and there is nothing wrong with her having a single sex space too. She should be supported and respected. Why are her rights less important now? That is completely and utterly wrong. In the Kelly J example, well, Kelly J is a fantastically strong and brave woman, but but it still doesn't make it right. You know, police officers turning up to somebody's door like that. You know,
no, absolutely, and it's women's have their children as well. Like for that woman, her name was Bella Doe on Twitter. Her name is Bella Doe. I don't know if that's her actual name, but her daughter came down the stairs and defended her. Her daughter was amazing and fantastic. The two of them were amazing and fantastic. I don't know if there was another daughter in the mix as well, but it sounded like she was defending her mum's right to be able to say there's a difference between sex and gender, and that is within her legal right to do so. And yet this PCSO was kind of giving her the wrong version of the law.
Ridiculous, absolutely absurd and completely wrong what that PCSO was saying. You know, people have gone to court, haven't they, already to establish this, mayor status, sort of what she's done, the Alison Bailey Tribunal, all those things, have established that, you can talk about the reality of biological sex. It's crazy that we even perhaps have to say that, isn't it?
Yeah.
But what are the police doing anyway, you have to say, in sort of involving in people, taking offence at things? I mean, you referred to the recording of the gentleman, or the two gentlemen who were arrested, really. And I think there was a reference where a police officer said, you made somebody anxious.
Yes.
It's not the business, in my view, of the police to be dealing with everybody's anxiety and everybody's offence. That's not the role of the police in this country, really, to be controlling people's thought and the expression of their thought. What on earth is going on there? And it's just this constant slippage, really, of the police doing more and more outside of their core role.
Yeah. What about hate speech? So, or hate crime. So, I've recently, as a councillor, I've been asking questions of our council leader about the appropriateness of us hosting Drag Queen Story Hour and funding that as a council. I mean, A, it's a political thing, potentially, and B, it potentially also kind of flies in the face of just the established guidelines around safeguarding and not blurring the lines between adult entertainment and child education. And C, it doesn't really represent the LGBT community in any way, shape or form. A drag artist isn't someone who's trans. That's not what they're representing. And most people who are trans probably like to get on with their lives and pass as genuinely female or male if they possibly can, not to have this overly sexualized, sort of hyped up representation of women. So we're not even talking about trans people. But in sort of posting about this publicly as a councillor and saying, look, I'm asking questions about this, I've got concerns about it. I've been told, been called names, obviously, but another councillor has come on and said that he thinks that children are unsafe around me. So I know. So the lengths that people are going to, and the kinds of things that are being said to people. I mean, we don't have any protection in law, I don't think, as women, because there was recently, I remember there was a push, but it was unfortunately it was by Stella Creasy MP, to get hate crime against women on the basis of sex established in law, and that was opposed by a lot of us because the the gender ideology had been tagged onto it. So the fact that this definition of who is trans makes it impossible really to say what transphobia is. But if you had a bad law that didn't straighten all of that out, then people could be being prosecuted for transphobia when all they've said is what's currently in alignment with the law is that it's not possible to change sex, that there's a difference between men and women that needs to be taken account of in certain policies and spaces. I mean, do you think we now need to look at that again and maybe try and get something within legislation that specifically protects women on the basis of their sex and on the basis of their sex alone, regardless of what their gender identity is?
I mean, potentially, Mandy, but there's a long way to go, isn't there, really, before we get, all the organisations involved in sort of framing that law, really, to recognise what sex actually is, as opposed to, an interpretation that includes gender identity. We need to be really, really clear in our terms. Sex matters.
Yes.
I'll come back to the sort of drag queen story hour thing in a moment, if I may, but I mean, if I can just refer to the fact that, where it's getting so messy and confused, Keep Prison Single Sex, a fantastic organisation, obviously did an exercise recently around how police forces were recording perpetrators, victims, etc., their data recording. And the situation was an absolute mess. Lots of forces were allowing people to identify what their own gender was, really. And even allowing where people said they were non-binary to record an indeterminate finding. Data is important. Data integrity is important. It frames policies and services. If that is a mess and the police are, throwing it to the wind, really, then, that's completely wrong. And while I'm on the subject of Keep Prison Single Sex as well, that sort of conflation of sex with gender has led directly to men being placed in women's prisons, and I find it shocking that there hasn't been more of a ruckus in relation to that, and certainly a ruckus from the left, the political left, about those, the most vulnerable women in our society, really being incarcerated with men with often horrendous consequences. There are totally different offending patterns between females who go to prison and males who go to prison, and I just find that unforgivable. On the sort of drag queen story hour sort of thing, really, drag isn't really my thing. I know a lot of people like it, but my understanding of it is that it's an adult sort of industry, primarily associated with pubs and nightclubs, and people enjoy it. But what I would say in relation to the suitability to sort of translating that over to children, I mean, you've obviously said a lot there as well. But it's almost become untouchable from criticism, which is what you've seen with the accusations pointed at you. And what I would say is it is extremely dangerous to create any sacred caste of people that cannot be open to criticism without you being accused of hateful behaviour or some sort of phobia. That we know where the dangers lie, really, with creating a sacred caste of people from criticism.
And the whole thing around safeguarding and child safeguarding is that all of us, it's all of our responsibility, and it should always be okay for anyone to raise concerns for any reason. We shouldn't ever be suppressing anybody from raising concerns where it involves kids and potential avenues for predation. As well as it's not just that, it's just as well as blurring of boundaries. We're going to have one of our guests that we're having on within the next couple of weeks is going to talk more about embodiment and how the kinds of things that children need in order to be able to keep themselves safe. So I think that'll help us kind of unpack that area in a little bit more detail. We need to go to questions. I want to ask you just before we do about your activism. So we know that some women have written to their own chief constables. Is there any light at the end of the tunnel at the moment, do you think, with this?
Women across, all the sort of nation, England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland have written to their chief constables and to their police and crime commissioners, concerned women living in those police force areas, to see if they are implementing the NPCC policy that they agreed to support. There's a sort of variety of sort of responses coming back in relation to that. There are some sort of notable examples of people who are concerned about implementing it and who are carrying out further work first. I think it would be unfair if I didn't mention, that Greater Manchester Police, for instance, in fairness to them, have recently held a focus group with women of the Greater Manchester area to hear directly what their concerns are from them before they decide anything. And that's to their credit, at least they're listening now. So, well done the officers who've done that. But primarily what's coming back from other forces is they're working towards implementing this searching guidance by the beginning of December. So it looks as though it's going to be in place in virtually all police force areas by the beginning of December.
So we've got a little window of time really to kick up fuss about this and say it's
Absolutely.
not good enough for people to judge this on a case-by-case basis. It's not good enough for women to be left to know what their rights are, to be able that they can question if they don't want to be searched by somebody who's of the opposite sex, but that they may be charged themselves with that none of that's good enough. We need to just be saying no to
I go further, Mandy. I'd say, in your area in which you live, and for everybody else, you elect the PCC, the Police and Crime Commissioner, as your elected representative to hold the Chief Constable to account. They draw up a police and crime plan together, which is viewable online, which will contain policing objectives. Read it, write to your PCC. We are seeing PCC saying it's nothing to do with me, it's a matter for the Chief Constable. That isn't good enough. They're your elected representatives. Hold them to account, get them to hold Chief Constables to account, because it's just unacceptable.
I would say as well, Women's Rights Network are really, really good, aren't they, on some of these issues? Have they got yes, I love it. Have they got a standard kind of suggested letter or anything like that people can get hold of if they want just a starter for 10 of how to word it or how to get the Police and Crime Commissioner's email address or whatever?
We're always sort of willing to sort of help support people from the Women's Rights Network in sort of, taking forward action like this. We have, seen the sort of the similar letter sort of being used by concerned women for each police force area. And I have to say as well, some police forces have said, we've become aware that other police forces have had this letter. And it's almost been a situation where you can almost feel their shock that women can actually mobilise, organise and have concerns and articulate them. Really, it's 2022.
Yeah, it's only because women have collectivised really that we've got action on prisons, on the issue with prisons, on the issue with the CAS review and the Tavistock closure, all of these things, that we're seeing now as well. It's only because of women, isn't it? Collectively mobilising, so they need to watch out. So let's have a look at some of our questions, because I'll get in trouble if I could carry on talking. But so Artemis Rising has said, have police officers complained to the College of Policing or Police Federation yet? And do you know of an FOI?
I don't know if police officers have complained as yet. What I would say is it's really difficult for police officers because they're subject to sort of an internal discipline code, and I would suggest they're probably, where even if they're sort of concerned, they'd be sort of keeping their heads down. It's just really difficult. You have to bear in mind, police officers aren't unionised as well. They have no industrial rights. They have a staff association who clearly is not bothered about this because they've said absolutely nothing about it. And those police officers would be worried that they'll end up being done on an internal disciplinary if they say too much and put their jobs in jeopardy.
Yeah, this is the same as me. I hear from teachers and different people who professionally feel that they can't say anything at work because that's their income, that's their bread and butter. But they're scared and they're worried and they feel compromised. So I think for most officers, they probably feel they're in an impossible position, being put in a really horrible position. Yeah. But
it's a really good question by Artemis Rising, I have to say, and it just shows the sort of difficult position that police officers are actually in terms of speaking out.
Baxter L says, don't forget about the police spies, equity and abuses of women. Is that, I think he might be talking about where groups were infiltrated, environmental activist groups and left-wing groups were infiltrated and men posed as the boyfriends of women, even married them in some cases, impregnated them.
I know.
Is that what that refers to? I think
that's probably what it refers to, isn't it? And, I think Baxter's, right to sort of bring that up, it's in the mix, isn't it, really? The suffering of those women, really, and the sort of,
the absolute shocking misogyny. And again, that wouldn't have been at the street level. frontline officers level, that will have been higher up those decisions were taken, and
And
those ethics were breached. Yeah.
It does also sort of highlight really that those police officers, without, going into every individual case, are asked to carry out a sort of very undercover sort of plainclothes role. Where's the supervision of those officers then in terms of, how far they go in and what they get involved in as well?
Yeah. There's another question there from Artemis Rising, but I'll go to, well, there's quite a few. Hang on. Bronwyn Davis. How do we get the police to follow the law and the PACE guidelines, not Stonewall's misrepresentations of the law? How do we do it?
Well,
what you've said, I suppose.
We're trying our best now through pressure. Bronwyn, I have a massive respect for Bronwyn. I know Bronwyn, wonderful woman. I would sort of suggest really that I think the police are going to find themselves at some stage either with sort of individual legal cases where a woman has been searched. I'd hate to think that that was going to happen, or potentially in judicial review territory. There's all sorts of sort of possible levels to where this could go. But I would sort of, I would hope that the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners would also get their acts together in relation to this. I haven't mentioned them much, but there are some sensible PCCs. I'd like to think.
Yeah, well, they need our votes. They're elected representatives and they need our votes. And my impression is that a lot of them, like a lot of politicians, would like to just bury their heads and avoid having to talk about this or confront it. Yeah. So for me, it's our job as women to make sure that they are not able to do that. We need to put them on the spot and make them feel awkward and make them answer.
Mandy, it's only the difficult people who change things. A lot of people only want to hear from people who are, submissive or compliant, etc. But in the end, it's only the difficult people shouting up at the back of the room who ever change anything. So,
absolutely, and you don't get the privilege of being elected to be a public representative and then not answer difficult questions. That's what you're there to do, and I'm sure that they do enjoy a number of privileges and they get to enjoy that status, and they have to do the job that they're there to do, don't they? So Artemis Rising has said, do you expect a legal challenge to many police constabularies for their promoting Stonewall, lanyards, decorated cars, etc.? A legal challenge?
Oh, in terms of the sort of decoration of cars, etc.
I think in terms of maybe the politicization of it, because not so much the LGB angle, but the T aspect of it. There's a lot of confusion. There isn't really an agreed upon definition of what that means. People have the right not to go along with gender ideology. We've had that established in law, as you've said. So it's kind of, have the police taken this further really than they should do in terms of politicizing?
I sort of think, some things have happened with really good intentions to sort of deal with sort of mistakes in the past where the police have sort of been, I'm not saying they're perfect now. Please don't think I'm sort of saying that, because we know that's not the case. But I think, there's certainly been accusations, well-founded accusations in the past that police are sort of divorced from the community. And a number of instances, historically have happened to sort of, highlight that really in sharp focus. But I think the police are overcompensating, and that's why they've sort of ended up in this mess. They've tried to overcompensate for that, separation, etc., from the community by immersing themselves into sort of minority groups to try and give them confidence and re-establish police trust. But in doing so, in sort of displaying all these flags, badges, and sort of, taking part in parades, police are then sort of compromising their appearance of impartiality and just really annoying people, with really good reason as well. I can see that some forces are stepping back a little bit from doing that, but a lot seem to be sort of, they're really embracing it, and they're having all these sort of cars and vans wrapped, and various departments, etc., sort of celebrating particular days. And I think it really annoys the public when they see days being celebrated throughout the calendar that are very much focused in one direction.
Yes.
But it's not applied equitably to everybody. So I just think we need to get back to just trying to be as impartial as possible and not involving themselves in any of that.
Yeah, because I think that the way that it's being implemented, it can have, as we've said, a chilling effect on people's freedom of speech. And particularly if an officer gets the wrong end of the stick and they take it too far, and they're on someone who's a rape victim's doorstep telling them that they have to believe this, and they can't believe that. It's it's clearly gone too far. Yeah.
Well, why would we be surprised that that has happened when the ideology is coming down from the top?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Can I just ask you, because we've just got a few more minutes, about your political activism? So tell us about Jennifer Swain and how she's doing now.
Jennifer Swain is an absolutely lovely woman in the Newport area of South Wales. And a lot of people will remember that quite a few months ago, she was actually arrested. She's a lady who gets around on a mobility scooter, which she nicknames Dwayne. And she was arrested for putting around pro-women's rights stickers. She was held in custody for many, many hours. Her home was searched. A book was seized from her house, a sort of women's rights, a book related to women's rights in relation to, I think, conversion of children. Stickers were seized from her house, etc. She was held on bail for several months. So she had to go through all that sort of agony, really. And sort of look at media articles calling her sort of transphobic, hateful, and sort of suggesting that there was an allegation that there were razor blades underneath stickers. You know, that whole urban myth. I'd have thought the police would have wised up to that one, because it's just, you know, absolutely nonsensical. And eventually, you know, the CPS, it went all the way to the Crown Prosecution Service, who basically kicked it into touch and said no further action. So yeah, Jen Swain, we had a number of events outside Newport Police Station to support her, some organised by ourselves, WRN Wales and Merched Cymru, LGB Allies Cymru, Labour Women's Declaration, and a number of other groups, WDI.
Sex Matters.
Philia were there, you know, and there was another event as well at which Kelly J. Keane came down from Standing for Women as well outside Newport Police Station. So we certainly, you know, put a lot of support around Jen. And, you know, she's a lovely woman. She should never have gone through that. And she's never been arrested for stickers.
No. It's similar to what's happened with Bella Doe, isn't it? The women have kind of gathered around them and offered them that comfort and that support. It's incredibly important, I think, that thank you for name checking all of those organisations, and we'll make sure that we put links to them in the information underneath the video. But just to say that we can't fight, any of us can fight this. We can't fight it individually, alone and separately. And one of the kind of silver linings to this horrendous situation is that women have started to come back together again really strongly and support each other and to coordinate in how we're campaigning. So I don't know. I mean, I find that a huge comfort as well, just to know that I'm not the only one. So thank you very much to all of these organisations. And I want to thank you as well, Cathy, for coming on and speaking so frankly and warmly, really, about a difficult topic. I would like to remind everyone again, if you could subscribe to our YouTube channel, that would be really helpful. We'll be back again next week. And thanks once again, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Mandy. Thanks, everybody.